The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies is one of the most controversial movies out there. It is definitely the worst of the Hobbit films and is the worst in the Middle-earth saga. But just because it's the worst, does that necessarily make it bad? Well, that's what I'm gonna talk about today in part 3. If you haven't seen the first two parts and would like to watch those videos before watching this one, the links will be in the description. But anyways, let's get right into the conclusion of this trilogy with the Battle of the Five Armies. So starting off, the Battle of the Five Armies right from the get-go is unique from the other two Hobbit films because this is the only one that doesn't start off with an opening prologue. It immediately jumps right back into where we left off at the end of the Desolation of Smaug, and this scene is absolutely phenomenal. This film gives you no time to ease back in and just takes off like a bullet. It actually made me feel some pity for the people of Lake Town for a second because Smaug is just absolutely incinerating these people to shreds. This scene also turns into the most emotionally powerful scene in the film when Bard takes up arms in a seemingly hopeless situation against Smaug. Bard the bowman is the sole person who chooses to fight. He shoots arrow after arrow knowing that he's never going to pierce the dragon's hide, but he does it anyway because he feels the utmost responsibility to defend and die if need be for the defense of his people. Just like in Desolation of Smaug and the Bilbo and Smaug scene, they do a very good job here of making us feel like Bard is an ant versus a god. When Bard's son delivers to him a black arrow, it gives him one chance to possibly kill the dragon. But even with this one arrow, it still feels like a hopeless situation. I think the most powerful couple shots in the movie is when Smaug lets out a massive roar and begins sprinting at Bard and Bane. As Bard stares down death in the face as it sprints right at him, Bane is extremely frightened. But Bard instructs Bane not to look at the monster, but says, "Look at me," guiding his son to remain calm until the end. And then, whether it was fate or possibly a little bit of luck, the one shot that Bard shoots is so precise, it hits Smaug in the very small hole in his armor, penetrating his organs. Smaug lets out a cry of searing pain and dies. Bard has become Bard the Dragon Slayer. This is an absolutely fantastic opening scene. There is something about the Hobbit trilogy that they all just start out with incredible opening sequences. But sadly, in the case of the Battle of the Five Armies, the opening scene is the best part of the film, and it never reaches that level again. So after the conclusion of the opening sequence, we get a lot of generic aftermath sort of stuff with the people of Lake Town, which I really didn't care for at all. One thing of note, however, is that Bard seemingly becomes the temporary leader of Lake Town. But another big thing that happens is Kili and Tauriel are separated from each other, and it's presented as if it's supposed to be some sort of highly emotional scene. And just as I promised in part 2, I think that this is a good time to give my thoughts on the pretty stupid love affair between Kili and Tauriel. Now, it's not that this relationship in theory couldn't have worked. Anything that is written well can work. But this love story is written pretty horribly. And there are two main issues with it. One is that it feels extremely forced. And it feels that way because not only does it seemingly come out of nowhere without any sort of build-up to support it, but it also doesn't benefit the story at all or provide any sort of depth really to the two characters involved. You know why Aragorn and Arwen's love story in The Lord of the Rings works? Because it's much more naturally implemented throughout the story, and it provides depth to the story while also providing depth to the two characters involved. The second reason is because there is nowhere near enough time given to this relationship to give us the emotional impact that the writers think they're giving us when Kili eventually dies. Just to show you how severe this flaw is, we're going to play a little game counting how many times Kili and Tauriel actually interact with each other throughout the whole trilogy. Alright, begin. So Tauriel locks Kili up in a dungeon and they both find each other to be hot. That's one. Kili escapes from Mirkwood with the other dwarves, but although Kili and Tauriel are in the same battle scene, they never actually interact with each other, so this doesn't count. Kili is about to die and Tauriel comes to save him with some elf magic. She starts glowing up and Kili starts telling her love poems. Alright, we're on 2. Now after this, they are together for a decent amount of time, at least film-wise, but it's really only one night and the morning after, so I'm only gonna count this as one meeting. So we're still on 2. Fast forward to the end of Five Armies, Kili and Tauriel meet up to take on Bolg together. Alright, we're on 3. But after this, Bolg kills Kili and that's it. Kili and Tauriel interacted with each other throughout this whole trilogy a grand total of 3 times. That's it. And you really think that I'm going to feel something during this scene? Well, I don't. Now before I move on from this, some of you may be asking, in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Aragorn and Arwen also don't interact with each other many times throughout the films either. It plays out much more as a love at long distance sort of relationship. And yes, you are correct. But the difference in that relationship is they give us context very early on that Aragorn and Arwen have known each other and loved each other for a long time before the events of Fellowship even happen. Whereas for Keely and Tauriel, the desolation of Smaug is the first time they've ever met each other. And that's why this love story just doesn't work. So moving on from that, back at Erebor, oh, wait, I almost forgot. We have to finish off Gandalf's side quest. Pretty much everything I've needed to say about this side quest has already been said. This is really just a brief sequence that finishes it off. Galadriel, Elrond, and Saruman come to save Gandalf, and they have a pretty goofy looking fight with the Nazgul. Sauron reveals himself to the rest of the group, Galadriel banishes him to the east, and Saruman says that he'll take care of him, which leads into the events of the Lord of the Rings. And that's pretty much the end of that. So as I was saying, back at Erebor, Thorin has developed a disease called dragon sickness, which is pretty much just a fancy way of saying he's greedy as fuck. And I was not a fan of this plot point at all. How can a seemingly not very greedy man for this entire trilogy go from that to the most greedy asshole in the snap of a finger? It makes no sense. It all of a sudden just appears, without any real build-up whatsoever besides a handful of shots from the desolation of Smaug, and that's it. Another thing is, why is this just affecting him now? He saw this treasure hold every single day when he was prince, but it didn't affect him then. What, is it just because he's got a different title now that it affects him? They honestly make it seem as if it's more like a dark spell than a sickness. And because of this guy's greed that appears out of nowhere, it leads to the events of the entire second half of the movie, which is the actual battle of the Five Armies. So from here on out, it's just non-stop action, and there's really not a whole lot of content to analyze. So what I'm gonna do is take a look at each of the Five Armies individually before looking at the final fight between Thorin and Azog. So let's start off with the Dwarf Army. Now, out of all the Five Armies, the Dwarf Army is probably my favorite. They have a strong motivation for fighting, which is defending Erebor, of course, and it's led by a charismatic screen presence in Dane. They also had the most riding on this battle, so I was rooting for them to win the whole time. It also helps that they're the same race as our main characters, so I felt more attached to them for that reason. The one dumb thing I will say regarding around the dwarves though, comes in the beginning of the battle and is actually even more pronounced in the extended version. So in the extended version, the dwarves and the elves began the battle fighting each other, but when the orcs show up, the dwarves and elves just stop fighting each other to go fight the orcs. This makes no sense. If you were fighting each other and then the orcs happen to join the fight, wouldn't it just turn into a 1v1v1 instead of a 2v1? Why are the dwarves and elves now fighting side by side with no sort of official or verbal agreement? That's just not how war works. The second army is the army of Lake Town, and at least they have a good reason for fighting, unlike another army we'll get to in a minute. They were promised riches from the dwarves, but the only thing that the dwarves brung upon them was ruin and death. But even though they have a valid reason for fighting, my brain couldn't help but just turn off during all the action sequences in Dale. The script has still not given me a reason to really care about these people. The third army is the army of the elves, and I absolutely hated the elves in this movie. Thranduil declares war on the dwarves so that he can retrieve the white gems of Lasgulin. Are you kidding me? You are going to go to war and sacrifice thousands of your soldiers for a necklace. This is beyond dumb, and the screenplay even acknowledges how dumb this is. The fourth and fifth armies are just two orc armies. The one led by Azog is the only one that actually matters though, because they're the ones that do the majority of the fighting. I mean, the orcs are just orcs. They've always been the minions of Middle-earth, so there's not really too much I can say about them. I will say that I didn't get the same sense of threat like I did say in Helm's Deep, but they were inoffensive, so I didn't have a problem with them. The other orc army just gets wiped out immediately by a big bear, a wizard with bird shit in his hair, and the eagles. Remember back in part 1 when I said that the eagles just show up in The Hobbit to bail our heroes out of getting killed instead of them having to earn it? Well, this is the other instance of that happening. So all this buildup of the second orc army that's been going on for the whole movie just didn't matter. In terms of the action itself, I thought it was pretty good in sections. There is a little bit of overkill in the CGI department, and by today's standards doesn't look the greatest, but I think that it's forgivable, and although it does look pretty fake, it's still a visual spectacle. Another thing that I'll praise too is I really got a good sense of geography of the battle, which is definitely no easy task for an action sequence this grand, so I have to give credit to the filmmakers there. Now the only real big event that's left is the final battle, but before I touch on that, I have to really quickly touch on the worst part of the Battle of the Five Armies, which is Alfred. Alfred single-handedly tanks this movie into the ground. I think that the best way to describe Alfred is quite simply just a bitch. He kinda reminds me a lot of Grima from Lord of the Rings, but at least Grima has some solid defining character traits. He was creepy, he was deceitful, but Alfred is just a constant annoyance that never goes away. And the worst part about Alfred is if you remove him entirely from this trilogy, absolutely nothing changes. Alright, enough of that, let's get into the final battle. And I will say that I did enjoy this final battle quite a bit. One thing that they do before they actually start the battle is kill Fili and Kili, which is important because now there is no heir to the throne, which means that if Thorin loses, the line of Durin is finished. So that's a nice way that they implemented a little more tension going into it. I think the thing that I like the most about the final battle is just how focused it is. It is quite simply two beings on a square of ice trying to kill each other. The choreography is good, and you really get a sense of weight behind every swing of the sword. I do wish that they didn't intercut this with the side battle between Legolas and Bolg, but that's really only a minor gripe. I also found it interesting how they kill each other instead of just one of them prevailing. They both get what they want, but they each have to pay the ultimate price. Azog finally wipes out the direct line of Durin, but it cost him his life. Thorin successfully defends his kingdom and finally finishes off his sworn enemy, but also has to pay with it with his life, ending the direct line of Durin's bloodline. However, it does live on in the indirect line with Dane, his cousin, who ends up becoming king. There aren't many plot points that I'm a big fan of in this film, but this whole ending fight sequence was one that I thought was really well thought out. Also, after this, it would have been nice to have gotten a sort of epilogue like we got in Lord of the Rings, because we don't really know exactly what happened after all this fighting. I'm sure there's an explanation somewhere in the Tolkienverse, but a film shouldn't have to rely on stuff that isn't in the movie in order to give itself a satisfying ending. In the final scene, Bilbo returns to Bag End, and we get a time jump to the timeline of the Lord of the Rings. We get a recreation of one of the first scenes from Fellowship, and the movie ends. Overall, although I enjoyed myself in parts while watching this film, the Battle of the Five Armies most certainly has a lot of flaws. And because of this, even on a good day, I can only consider this movie to be mediocre at best. It is certainly the worst of the trilogy. And I think that it largely has to do with the fact that the majority of this movie is fiction to what Tolkien actually wrote. Everything that happens after Smaug dies is an extremely drawn-out version of what actually happened in the book, which really makes me believe that The Hobbit didn't need to be a trilogy. It's a very common opinion that The Hobbit would have benefited from being just 2-3 hour or so films, and I share this opinion. Looking at The Hobbit as a whole, I do think that it is a solid trilogy and is quite often overhated. The Hobbit actually reminds me a lot of the Star Wars prequels in the sense that the original trilogy of both franchises were so good that it was almost impossible for the prequels to live up to them. But I do actually believe with some minor changes to the story, and if they were to cut out a lot of the unnecessary things, that a lot of people would hold The Hobbit on par, or at least almost on par with The Lord of the Rings. But even though we didn't get the perfect trilogy, I will always like The Hobbit, and nobody's gonna change my opinion on that. Well, that's gonna do it for this video, guys, bringing an end to part 3 and this mini-series of The Hobbit. If you made it this far and you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and leave a like and hit that subscribe button. If you want to be notified about my next video, make sure to hit that notification bell, because the Ahsoka series is right on the horizon, and you definitely won't want to miss my videos for that. But anyways, that's all I got for today. I'll see you next time.